in Cork. I have given this talk on a couple of occasions, and we did have good turnouts, especially in the locale where the refugee camp, where the passengers were accommodated, which I'll be coming on to in the course of my talk, where there were people in that locality who themselves remembered the refugees. Some of them may indeed have met Mal and some of those others. But I'll be coming back to that later on. So I'll begin. I'll just get cracking because there is a lot to get through. I'll share the screen with the PowerPoint that I've presented, and it'll take about an hour and a half, maybe 45, 50 minutes to begin. A 5-minute break just for everyone, just to stretch their legs, and then we'll go up on the final lap. So I'll resume here somewhere. PowerPoint, here it is. So share. I'll just go back to the beginning. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that screen. I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't be able to, obviously with people's microphones being muted, but if everybody could just maybe, if you could nod to let me know that you can see the screen.
We can see it.
Excellent. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so I'll just get going, and hopefully there won't be any technical problems. Okay, so title, slightly ironic for those of you who remember the awful film about 40 years ago starring Pele and Bobby Moore, Escape to Victory. It's a slight pun on that title, Escaping by Victory, of course, being the name of the ship. Now, I know that the vast majority of those who are logging on here are perhaps coming from the Estonian angle, of course, given the fact that it is being hosted by the Estonian Studies Centre. My angle of attack, as will be evident pretty immediately, is more from the Irish perspective. I do bring in some of the other perspectives, Estonian, Swedish, Canadian, but inevitably the angle at which I'm approaching the material means that it is skewed, as it were, towards the Irish dimension. But I think that that's interesting. Okay, so we begin on Friday the 30th of September 1949, the proverbial slow news day. The weather in Cork, for those when the refugees arrived, there were showers. And as I said, they're not for the last time. Very few things going on domestically. There was the Labour Party conference of Ireland was happening in Cork. Internationally, probably the only thing that really people in Cork were noting was the death of a Catholic archbishop who 30 years before, had been the archbishop in London when the famous hunger strike of Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, had taken place during the Irish War of Independence. There were strikes going on in the economy, advertisement for work in British factories. This was a very depressed era in Irish history, and I'll be coming back to that also. And in the cinema, you had all the film stars of the day, Tyrone Power, David Niven, Margaret Leighton, starring in all the various different blockbusters. In the Opera House, which we'll be coming back to, you had the All-Star Review, and there is a victory dimension to that. And in sport, the famous Listowel races, one of the major race meets in Ireland, an annual race meet was taking place. And then in the afternoon, this happened. You had the arrival of a ship absolutely full to overflowing with refugees, almost none of whom spoke English. And of course, the ability to speak Estonian or Polish or any of the other languages of those people on board was in short supply in Cork. So there was precious little communication other than through the international language of money, which we'll be coming on to in a second. And this is the initial report of what happened. The first report in the local paper, the Cork Examiner. I won't go into detail in the report because pretty much everything in this report is something that we'll be coming on to. Just a couple of things to notice here, what I mentioned here about money, where the people on board were already desperately hungry, having been at sea for several days already and facing into a long and, to put it mildly, perilous journey across the Atlantic. Many of them had barely eaten during their time at sea, whether through choice or whether because of the choppy nature of the crossing already. that they were buying whatever they could at the dockside in Cove, a port just down from the city of Cork. And then it lists the nationalities: Estonians, who predominated, Poles, Finns, Latvians, Czechs, Yugoslavs, Lithuanians, a Sweden, a Hungarian, and another Russian, with lots of children on board, details of how the ship left Sweden, and noting that they had to stop in Cork for repairs to the ship. So all of these details, don't worry, we'll be coming back to in the course of the lecture. But this is the first major report of what was to become at least sort of a 2-year saga. So this is the overview of what we'll be talking about. This is the first part. We're going to have a look at the context within which these events are taking place. The events on the European continent, which in effect drove the refugees to seek a new life across the Atlantic, and in particular having a look at the position of, well, Sweden, Canada, and Estonia as well. But Sweden is where those refugees had congregated. Canada was their intended destination. We're going to have a look at the process by which a transatlantic voyages were already taking place. This was not the first, albeit it was pretty much the last of these type of private undertakings. Some people had tried to go to America, but Canada was the destination of choice for reasons which we'll be coming back to. And in particular, those leaving from Sweden got the moniker the Viking boats. And then we'll have a look at a little bit of details about the Victory itself, what its purpose was when it was constructed, and how it was utterly ill-suited to the voyage it was intended to undertake. Then, perhaps teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, we're going to be having a look at the refugees themselves. And again, I'm very conscious of the fact that at least some of those who are on board the ship are listening here, and many others will be the children or grandchildren of those on board. So having a look at sort of breaking the 300 plus passengers down by nationality, by age, marital status, occupational status, going into some details then about how they arrived in Cork from Sweden, and then having a look at a number of what one would term human interest stories. We're not going to be dealing with 300 and plus people in the aggregate. We are going to have a look at some of the individual stories, some of which are quite humorous, some of which are not. So all human life was there. And then the last part before we have our break, we're going to have a look at the response in Cork itself, the immediate local response, noting some of the various different considerations that we have to take place. So at that point, we'll take our break, and then we'll come on to what we term some of the international, interstate, legal aspects of the situation, because it isn't just a question of a group of individuals undertaking one journey. There are a whole series of considerations that had to be borne in mind by the Irish government, by the Canadian government, by the Swedish government, and noting, of course, that there were a number of complications, not least of which in the Estonian context was that Estonia had been illegally occupied and annexed by the Soviet Union. And in that sense, the government of Estonia was in effect a government in exile, and therefore not particularly well placed to do very much about what was happening to Estonian nationals. But we're then going to have a look at how the matter was resolved, before concluding with a couple of folk memories here in Cork, where people remember what went on, and with some conclusions and observations. So to get straight in, again, much of this will be familiar, so I won't dwell on this, but of course the central issue is the advance of the Soviet Union into Central and Eastern Europe as a consequence of, first of all, the Red Army's advance at the end of the Second World War, its occupation of Germany in 1945, and of course then the establishment of a whole series of communist satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe in the aftermath in the late 1940s. In effect, the Western allies, particularly Britain and America, sanctioned this creation of a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe at the Yalta Agreement, and you had the imposition, and of course it was the imposition of communist regimes in many of the countries from which the refugees had fled. Of course, for the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, all three had been incorporated or annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940. That annexation was not recognised by the Western powers, and the three nations had to So for two occupations, initially the Nazi occupation of 1941 to 44, and then you had the restoration of Soviet control in 1944 onwards. Two very brutal occupations, and I'm sure that those who are listening in know far more about that than I do. Of course, following on from these annexations, you have the general atmosphere of the Cold War, which seems to be reaching a peak in late 1949. You have the Berlin Blockade between mid-1948 and early summer 1949. You have the creation of NATO itself in April 1949. And you have growing coordination on the military front, in effect, was giving rise to the Warsaw Pact. So the Cold War was not just cold at this point. It seemed as if it might turn hot at any moment. And even if there wasn't a shooting match breaking out, there was always the fear of the domino effect of some of the regimes that hadn't turned communist in the Nordic countries, such as Finland, such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, etc., might fall under Soviet control. So all of these considerations play a part. Looking now at the position of Sweden, which of course is the country from which the refugees sailed, the Vikings sailed. Many refugees made their way to Sweden either during the Second World War, either fleeing communism in the first instance, Nazism, or then communism again in the post-war period. Certainly many Baltic refugees had fled as soon as the annexation was undertaken by the Soviet Union, or indeed even before that. And in some of the other countries that are provided refugees, for example, in 1947, the non-communist Polish leadership fled to Poland to avoid simple execution, which were going to be their certain fate following the creation of the communist regime in that country. So you have this domino effect, which I previously mentioned, where many of the Baltic states had already fallen foul of communism, and the fear was that this was going to very swiftly happen to places like Sweden and elsewhere. And there was also the fear that the Swedish government, in order to curry favour with the Soviet Union, might seek to repatriate those in Sweden, those refugees, back to their home countries or to the USSR. So it isn't just a fear of annexation or invasion by the Soviet Union. The fear was that the Swedish government may seek to get rid of this problem. And as we'll see in a few minutes, the Swedish government made it abundantly clear they wanted the refugees to leave, preferably to go home, but certainly it would no longer be a Swedish problem. So the refugees of all nationalities wanted to get out of Sweden as quickly as they possibly could. And of course, they were assisted in this by the fact that in the aftermath of the Second World War, there was a huge glut in Western Europe of shipping which had been constructed initially for military purposes, particularly in regard to the invasion of Europe, D-Day in 1944. And a lot of this shipping had simply gone on the open market. So you could actually buy a ship reasonably quickly. Whether, of course, it was a ship that would be suitable for the type of journey that people wished to take was another matter. The problem, however, is that in terms of the formal international coordinated effort to deal with those individuals who'd been displaced by war conditions and afterwards via the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, Sweden was not a member of that organization. And therefore, the refugees who were located in Sweden did not enjoy, as it were, the nominal legal protections provided by the classification as a displaced person, and weren't able to participate in the various different schemes which the IRO was organising to move people, particularly to the New World, to Canada and the United States. So they find themselves in a country which doesn't want them. They find themselves in a country which they fear may fall under communist control at any moment. They find that they're not able to participate in the international movement, transportation of people to the New World. So the inevitable consequence was that the individuals involved and the groups involved started to consider the possibility of doing it themselves. So here we have just proof of the attitude of the Swedish government in July 1945. I won't read the whole extract because you can read the extract for those of you who are interested if you look at the YouTube video. But the key phrase is this one just here. Although no pressure is being applied, it is the desire of Sweden that the Baltic refugees should return to their homeland. So this is in 1945, several years before the Victory sailed. But it was clear that the Swedish government found themselves with a great problem on their hands. Some of the individuals in Sweden, not just of those on the Victory but elsewhere, were people that the Soviet Union wanted to get their hands on for a variety of different reasons. So the Swedish government found the refugees a difficult problem to solve. They did not wish to hand them over to the Soviet Union because they, I think, realised that what the fate would be of anybody who the Soviet Union suspected even remotely of opposing the imposition of Soviet rule. At the same time, if the Soviet Union did move on Sweden, this would provide a pretext, as it were, and certainly a reason to not think well of the Swedish government in that scenario. So the Swedish government wanted the refugees out. Okay, so Canada, moving on to Canada. Canada was the destination of choice for many, perhaps even more than the United States. There were fewer restrictions. The Americans, of course, had restrictions on immigration really since the Great Depression, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, they were still pretty keen to make sure that nobody slipped the net and came into the United States who, for example, had been fighting the United States. Although, of course, you did have individuals like Wernher von Braun, the architect of the German V-2 rocket program, who, of course, became centrally involved in the American space program. But the real priority, the real destination was Canada. Canada needed labour. And there was, of course, a ready supply of labour. It preferred immigrants from English-speaking countries. I'm not quite so sure whether there was any preference for any immigrants from French-speaking countries, although I don't think there was a huge number of French speakers who wished to move to Canada at that point. But I could be wrong in that. That's not necessarily an area of expertise of mine. So 100,000 displaced persons were admitted to Canada during this period of the late 1940s through the International Refugee Organization. But one should note that the Canadians had their own views on the type of people who were coming and whether they were the right sort. Displaced persons, this is an extract from a Canadian government doctrine. Displaced persons would be selected like good beef cattle, with a preference for young men who could do manual labour and would not be encumbered by ageing relatives. Note the ageism involves certainly only young people need apply. Talking now about those people who were refugees in Sweden. These people may be worthy of our sympathy, but they are certainly the most undesirable people as immigrants. Our police forces will have their work doubled. As for the Poles, they will be unemployed or in jail, and in either case quite happy. The Lithuanians are as bad as the Poles. Apologies here to any Lithuanians or Poles who are listening in. These are Canadians speaking, not myself. Of course, the Estonians will be glad to hear this next sentence. Latvian and Estonians, by way of contrast, are honest, ingenious and good workers. They would make good immigrants. So here we have some details from Time magazine noting the refugees who were going over, and in this case trying to make their destination the United States, and making some comparisons with the Mayflower, noting that the ships that were sailing, trying to make the transatlantic crossing, were much smaller than the Mayflower had done several hundred years before. But it's with the Viking boats, those who were sailing from Sweden to Canada, that were mainly interested here. So between 1948 and 1949, there were 10 of these, as it were, private enterprise boats. The Viking boats sailed from Sweden to Canada. There was a syndicate created by Estonian refugees, the Kalev Syndicate, and this syndicate organised the purchase of most of these boats, although some freelance operations were undertaken outside the syndicate. So just to give an itinerary, in August 1948, you had 4 vessels making the journey, and these varied in size between 28 passengers and 73 passengers. Some of those who were on board were some of the owners. And then they also charged others who were making the voyage for their passage, and that was the way in which they sought to recoup their investment. In August, of course, the weather was reasonably benign, and even though the Canadian government had given no sanction to these ships arriving in advance, the passengers were admitted, notwithstanding the fact that most of them didn't have enough or particularly sort of plentiful supply of documentation, given the circumstances in which they'd left their home country. Of course, that was always going to be difficult. So there were security screenings. Of course, this was a major issue, an understandable issue for the Canadian government, as was the issue of the health of the passengers. With this initial inflow having been accepted, the Canadian government then started to get a little bit concerned. So they made it their business to send a message to Sweden that anybody who was thinking of doing something similar should cease and desist. But these warnings were not successful. So desperate were those who were in Sweden to get out that they were prepared to take any risk, including the risk of rejection when they got to Canada in order to simply get away from Europe. The single largest ship prior to the victory as part of these Viking boats was the SS Walnut in November 1948. Note the time of year in November. Of course, the weather in the Atlantic crossing in November is not to be sniffed at, to put it mildly. And the Canadian government now started to get very concerned because of the sheer size of the ship and the onboard conditions, the risk of sinking, the cost of looking after the passengers initially when they arrived. The flow then ceased to a certain extent over winter.
If I could interject here, Professor Doherty, there is an Irish angle to the SS Walnut trip. It apparently stopped by in Sligo to recall.
Okay.
At least one couple remained behind in Ireland from the Walnut.
Okay. Excellent. Well, that's as we'll see in the next. There is another one of these ships in the next point where there is also a stopping, and of course that has consequences for the Victory's docking in Cork. So 5 further boats in July and August. In total, 300 passengers. So again, small boats. The Saraband, which was one of these boats, did temporarily call into Cove en route. So there is a precedent before the Victory arrives for one of these Viking boats to arrive in Cove. They refueled and received a warm welcome. There was nothing wrong with this boat, so there was no question of it remaining. It sailed on. So you had sort of a slightly different composition of the passengers compared to the Victory, Latvian, Poles, Estonians, but also others as well. Interestingly, as is always the case in Ireland, there was one chancer who decided to join the vessel and get a trip over to Canada. Interestingly, he made the journey, but he was refused admittance upon arrival. I'm not quite sure whatever became of him. So this question then arises, did the Victory actually plan to dock in Cork? It was damaged during its departure from Gothenburg. But the question arises, bearing in mind the Saraband had made, as it were, if not a scheduled arrival in Cork, it wasn't expected, but it wasn't a forced arrival in Cork. One should note that the Poles on board had prepared Irish flags. So as they came into Cove, they were waving these Irish flags. So there's at least, I think, the possibility that it was always part of the plan to dock in Cork. Whether it was part of the plan, of course, to remain 2 years is doubtful. So to come on to the Victory itself, this had been built in Britain in early 1944 as part of the preparations for the invasion of Europe. A very large number of ships had been built, of course, in 1943, 1944, some in Britain, most in America, that provided the wherewithal for transporting the huge number of men and the huge amount of material from Britain to France in order to begin the push on Germany. Small, not tiny, but small enough, 380 tons. Its initial was designed to carry 50 soldiers for the short journey, in effect, from sort of Portsmouth to Normandy. A matter of a few score miles more than anything else. Certainly had no ocean-going capacity whatsoever. It was never intended that a boat of this class, of this description, should ever undertake such an onerous transatlantic journey. But it was purchased by the consortium and converted in Norway to what we might term a passenger carrying purpose, although how you could try to possibly conceive changing a ship which had a capacity of 50 soldiers for a journey that should last a few hours, for 400 plus individuals, passengers and crew, for a journey that would take weeks. Of course, you'd probably need to ask a ship's architect. So the ship was purchased for £20,000 approximately. Looking now at the details, these are the details supplied by the Irish authorities when the ship arrived. It had no safety certificate, quite unsafe for the carriage of passengers. Some of the passengers slept in temporary quarters on deck. These will be swept overboard by one Atlantic wave. If there was a single wave of any magnitude, for example, at night during the crossing, then large numbers of people simply would have been swept overboard to their death. The hull is of light structure, quite unsuitable to heavy seas. And it did note that one of these vessels was already in use in Ireland, giving pleasure cruises around Dublin Bay in the summer, but not in winter, because the way it was feared that it wouldn't be suitable for winter conditions, even in Dublin Bay, let alone in the Atlantic. In terms of the Irish Department of Justice, some more details. It understood that the vessel is owned by a group of Estonian displaced persons, some at least of whom are travelling on the vessel. This group formed a company, I believe, to have brought a number of British landing craft which have been converted into passenger carrying ships, or which they intend to use to carry displaced persons from Sweden to the American continent. The Swedes are embarrassed by the presence of these people, and there is a likelihood that the Swedes will wink at their leaving Sweden in ships which do not comply with international safety regulations. Okay, so much about the background. Who's on board ship? Well, 387 passengers were listed and 17 crew. Bearing in mind what was said previously about the preference for young people, almost all of those on board, passengers and crew, are under age of 14. 256 Estonians, 89 Poles, 11 Finns and Lithuanians, 4 Latvians, 2 Russians, 1 Yugoslav. In terms of the breakdown, 153 men, 125 women, and 96 children. The youngest passenger was only 5 weeks old. 85 family groups, some of which are incomplete. There were, in some cases, just fathers travelling with children, in some cases, just mothers travelling with children, and 77 singles. Interestingly, almost as soon as the passengers arrive, some of the women who were on board were pregnant. On the 6th of December, of October, only a week later, one of the Polish women on board gave birth to twins in a local nursing home, and they were baptised in a Catholic church here in the centre of Cork, Peter St Paul's, with 2 other refugees standing in as godparents. On the 16th of October, a Mrs. Lenny Katz gave birth to a baby boy who was Olayed Patrick. Patrick, of course, being the patron saint of Ireland.
Excuse me, can I make a correction on the name? It's Kants, K-A-N-T-S.
K-N-T-S.
N-T-S, yes, I know Patrick, yes. Okay.
It may be that the name was recorded incorrectly in the Irish newspaper which gave the report. I'd have to check. But thank you for that correction, and I will make it. In terms of the employment, the background, most of them, those are males, were occupied in industrial occupations, mechanics, and so on and so forth. About half the women were textile workers and dressmakers, but there was a smattering of professionals, doctors, medical students, chemists, engineers, and architects also. Okay, so to come on to the details of the departure from Sweden, and again, I'm very conscious of the fact that many of those logging in are maybe aware of these details, but I don't think everybody is. So there certainly was advanced intelligence that the Victory was intending to make the journey received by the Canadians, because they asked that a message be given to the captain of the Victory to don't think about it. In July 1949, a report was produced by the Canadian legation in Gothenburg, sent back to Canada, where A.A. Ewan had visited the ship and told the captain to come to the Canadian legation in Gothenburg, but had failed to do so. But he had given the captain a letter pointing out the Canadian objection to what was going on, and that he should not do what clearly that he was planning to do. Roughly speaking, there was about 800 kroner was the going rate, which was roughly the same as a third-class berth on a transatlantic liner, of which, of course, there were many undertaking the journey. Looking now, just quoting from the report well, actually, that should say the Cork Examiner rather than the Irish Examiner. It's changed its name in the meantime. On the 1st of October, one spokesman said they'd been living aboard the Victory at Gothenburg for 2 months because the harbour authorities would not allow them to proceed to sea. Eventually, they had a conference and decided to steal out at night at 2 a.m. on Sunday. They weighed anchor and steamed out slowly, hoping their departure would remain unnoticed. But it was not to be. They were observed by a harbour police launch who gave chase, held them, and ordered them to stop and return to port. This they refused to do, and on escaping into the darkness, the police launch had sent up a couple of rockets and then returned to port. I don't think the Canadians put too much up of a fight to try and stop the boat leaving, given, as we've already mentioned, the Swedes were keen to see the refugees depart. Their first mishap took place some hours later when the ship ran her bows up on some rocks, but fortunately they were to float off again a few minutes later, not before their shell plating forward near the bow had been holed, causing their forward freshwater tank to leak. And of course, bearing in mind what we said earlier about the possibility that a visit to Cove was not unthinkable, given that one of the previous vessels had made such a visit, the fact that this incident had taken place, that the ship was taking on water and that its fresh water supplies were basically disappearing, meant that a stop somewhere was going to be necessary before they set out onto the transatlantic voyage. This is an interview that was undertaken with the refugees, and it gives some very interesting answers. Why they left Sweden? Why did they leave Estonia, and why did they leave Sweden? And the answer was given: the occupation of Estonia by the Soviet Union, the Soviet terror, deportations and general terror. About 60,000 persons, children, and aged people being deported. You then had the horrors of the German occupation, and then the second Russian occupation. Continuing new deportations and revengeful terror. Anybody who was seen to have collaborated in any way, shape or form with the Germans, and that might mean simply not actively opposing them, were deemed to be a collaborator, and in effect their lives were forfeit. So many people left. 5,000 to Finland in 1945, in 44, 25,000 to Sweden, and 60,000 to Germany. So people fleeing for their lives. The situation in Sweden, why did they feel they needed to leave Sweden? Well, they felt that the situation in Sweden was moving the wrong direction fast. Sweden had extended de jure recognition of the annexation of Estonia in 1940. So it was no longer, as far as the Swedes were concerned, recognised as illegal. What that meant was that it recognised the Estonians in Sweden as Soviet citizens, which of course made their legal status highly problematic. Soviet marriage law is being applied to refugees now in Sweden. Some refugees seeking asylum in Sweden have been turned over to the Soviets already. So in 1945, 167 Baltic refugees had been turned over to the Soviets. So there was a precedent for people in Sweden to be handed straight over to the Soviets. And of course, there was little doubt that their fate was not going to be a desirable one. In 1946, the letter which we mentioned earlier on, the Swedish government sent to all refugees a circular letter in the name of the king, urging them to return home, which we've already noted. And there's different other signs that the situation in Sweden was becoming simply impossible, and that they had to get out. So that's the reason for their departure. Now to move on, as it were, to some of the individual stories of the passengers involved. This is taken from a Canadian website. Some of the details are spot on. Some of the details aren't entirely correct, but that's understandable given the passage of time. My parents sacrificed exceedingly to save enough to purchase a share in the freighter, which was going to take us to Canada. I remember seeing a chain gang of men loading hold with rocks for ballast, seeing as the only cargo was passengers. I remember being cautioned by my parents not to say anything to anyone. I suspect due to the illegality and foolhardiness of what this group was about to attempt. We sneaked out at night with no lights and in silence, but were either stopped by the British Navy or made for land due to mechanical and safety reasons. The ship was definitely not capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. During our brief trip on this little ship, I remember washing on deck by throwing a rope and bucket overboard and drawing it forth. It was the first time I tasted salt water. I didn't like it. Okay, and moving on now to his memories of Cork. The Victory was docked at Cork Island and the passengers distributed to various displaced persons camps. Actually, that wasn't the case. There was only one camp. It was in Ireland I was introduced to bangers, pork sausages, and I love them still. With the assistance of English and Canadian immigrant officials, I don't think there are any English immigrant officials involved, they were only Canadian, and the sponsorship of our rich baker relative, we were on the move again. All I remember of landing at Halifax was the sense of finally having arrived safely. Mission accomplished, and boy did I look good in my new clothes. My mother was a professional seamstress, and it was important to her not to look much like poor immigrants, which of course we were. So here we have a picture of the ship. What happened, and we'll come to this more details later on, the Irish government took the decision to move the ship from Cove, which is the harbour attached to Cork City, up the river into Cork City itself, largely because they suspected that those on board would do another runner as soon as the ship was repaired if they were given the chance. And the Irish government simply couldn't allow that to happen for reasons which we'll be coming on to. Certainly anyone in Cork now would recognise this image, this site here, has barely changed in the last 70 years. This building still dominates that side of the port of Cork, and we can see there the ship just in front of us. And some images with due apologies to Getty Images, which I think is a monopoly of this and pretty well every other photograph as far as I can see. But you can see the passengers on board. I suppose there's one very good, this is my favourite one of the children. Simply in Ireland, there aren't very many people with pure blonde hair and sort of the type of light skin, which of course you can see so familiar to Estonians. I think this picture, this little girl seems to be having great fun altogether, and this little fella has a sort of slightly sort of pugnacious but comic look about him also. So these are they're obviously got off the ship. There's that. This is the building in the background, and these pictures taken before they moved to the refugee camp. This is where the ship is being repaired in Tivoli Docks, which is the port of Cork. You get an idea of the scale of the ship here. These are two of the individuals who are up at the front trying to repair the hull, which is just here at the front. Okay, so to move on now to the human interest, I'm very conscious I'm a little bit behind time already, so I'll try to move along. On the 3rd of October, only a couple of days after landing, a Polish factory worker who was on board received a message that his stepbrother, who was a pilot in the RAF, had been killed in a flying accident in Wales on Saturday. So tragedy was already afoot for some of those on board. An Estonian car repairer, Ernest Kormagati, again I apologise for my failure to pronounce Estonian correctly, showed our reporter several photographs of a miniature electrically driven motor car he'd built for his two sons who were also on the Victory with their mother. He'd taken the car apart and brought it in his baggage. Why? Well, he had heard, he said, that car repairers were well paid in Canada, and he had a visa to enter that country, which not everybody did. In terms of the religious aspects, the Lutherans, of course, the Estonians by and large, and some of the others, were provided through Lutheran services in Trinity Church in Cork, and the Catholics on board, which are largely the Poles, were provided for by a Polish priest who was actually in Cork at the time. This is the point at which I first entered the story. I was studying the history of these Polish students who were studying in Cork, sponsored by the Polish government in exile, and I came across a reference to some of the Polish students acting as interpreters for the ship which had docked, and it was at that point that I started to undertake my research. A Hungarian woman, one of those the Hungarians on board, Her husband was due to make the journey, but only hours before the ship departed, he developed appendicitis and had to stay in Gothenburg to receive medical treatment. So she had to make the journey on her own at very short notice without a husband, as she'd planned. 3 children, the youngest only months old, albeit her husband was able to join her only about 3 weeks later. Moving on now to some of the other details, that the Irish government made detailed reports on each of the individuals, and some of the reports, as it were, are reflections of Irish attitudes at the time. One Estonian widow was treated for syphilis. She expressed a wish to return to her Swedish fiancé, and I suppose reflective of the sexual morals of Ireland at the time. The note was that there was no place for her in Irish life, so the Irish government certainly had no objection to her returning to Sweden. Later on then, this is a report after many of the ongoing passengers had made the forward journey. 57 refugees remained, and there was a minority which gave considerable trouble, and with which the society have no powers to deal. The society is the Red Cross Society, which we'll come on to in a second. For example, one lady refuses to return to her husband with her family, although the husband has found work in Dublin. Others decline to accept necessary medical treatment, and it's the next one which I find a little bit comical. And one lady is engaged in a profession not regarded here as an honest livelihood. I don't think we really need to query what that dishonest livelihood might be. But so some of the others, I mentioned again here the Opera House in Cork, just to give an indication of the entrepreneurial spirit alive and well in Cork at the time. When it was heard that there was a good Polish fiddle player on board, he was pressed into action and recruited for a performance at the Opera House the following weekend. So on the 6th of the 10th, the following weekend, the manager of the Cork Opera House gave an audition to Mr. Ostrowski, a Polish refugee, on board the Victory, and then booked him as an additional act in the current variety show. And you can see here the billing for that, and you have a special booking, the virtuoso via violin and piano accordion of the refugee ship MV Victory. This, I think, is something which I think some of those who are listening may well remember. I think somebody sent me a picture of a wood carving that one of this man did, which I think may still survive. Johan Pern, again, I apologise for my pronunciation. He was one of the passengers on board, had no real facility with carving wood, but learned when he was waiting. And he then sold these carvings door to door. You can see here some of the carvings of birds, and the most popular version was a little toy robot where you pulled the strings and the arms and the legs pulled up, and this was a report that appeared in the Irish newspaper. He was the birdman, not so much of Alcatraz, but of the MV Victory. And people who I spoke to who remembered the Victory remembered him going from door to door in all parts of the city seeking to sell his wares. Another report, the inaugural Cork City Sports. The Cork City Sports is one of Ireland's biggest sports meetings, and in August 1958 held its inaugural meeting. And this is August 1950, so this is the following year, 1950. One of the Estonians who was still in Cork at this point, Victor Palango, jumped over 6 feet with his first and only attempt, with all the Irish not being particularly good, only managing 5'8". I don't know whether he was the Estonian high jump champion at that time, but he's certainly described as such. And this is, of course, an Estonian newspaper, so I presume it's accurate. So he was outside the competition. He wasn't recognised, but he won. His further partaking in the competition was prohibited for lack of time. Mr. Palango was sailing on the infamous Victory, which sailed from Sweden, and he has had no opportunities for training during the 10 months or so which had passed. Okay, again, very conscious of the fact I'm really running over time here, so I'll get through this reasonably quickly. Response in Cork. I suppose one should remember that even though Ireland was not a belligerent during the Second World War, the emergency, as that period is known in Ireland, impacted. There were many shortages, and these compounded the already existing problems which Ireland experienced, where endemic poverty, high levels of malnutrition and disease and death, unemployment and underemployment, particularly in rural areas. And of course, Ireland was still largely a rural society at that point. Very large-scale immigration, especially youth immigration to the United Kingdom. Sort of approximately 1.5% of the population were leaving every year, and that figure went up to about 5% in some years in the really dark days of the 1950s. There was political instability. There was a new government in power when the victory arrived, a rather unusual inter-party, multi-party coalition government in Ireland, and we'll be having a look at how that government responded to the victory later on. And a general sense of social malaise in Ireland. And I suppose the most important point of this is from the point of view of the victory, that there wasn't much money in Irish coffers. And of course, there were many people seeking to leave the country themselves, who were seeking to leave Ireland to go to Britain, but have been delighted to be able to get to Canada. So the Irish government had a difficult path to tread in terms of being fair to the refugees, but also not being seen to favour them over their own citizens. So the real turn of the knife in terms of the timing of the victory was that 1949 was the centenary of the end of the Irish famine. And of course, hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants had made the journey to Canada in that horrendous period of Irish history between 1845 and 1849. And one of the most resonant, haunting phrases in Irish history, not just of this period, but all of Irish history, is the concept of the Coffin Ship. The ships that set sail from Ireland, massively overcrowded, with horrendous sanitary conditions, high mortality rates on board, with many sinking en route to the United States. And to this day, the term coffin ship would be recognised by pretty well every Irish citizen as symbolising the desperate plight of famine migrants. And the real kicker, as it were, is that many of these coffin ships left from Cove, which was then known as Queenstown. So in 1949, 100 years after the end of the famine, when the end of the famine was being marked, you have, in effect, a coffin ship arriving into Cove. And if you have a look at this lithograph of a ship that had left 100 years before, it is virtually identical to the photographs on the deck of the Victory in terms of the degree of overcrowding. And these are an image of conditions below deck. If anything, I would imagine the conditions on board the Victory were far worse in terms of overcrowding. And just to illustrate that this point wasn't lost on anybody at the time, this is a newspaper article where the Victory was indeed described as a coffin ship. So that historical precedent, which was certainly not a fortunate one, was not lost on anybody. In terms of the response in Cork, and we have, I think, about 3 or 4 more slides to go and we will take a break. There was a spontaneous and very generous response. Many people just simply went to the dockside, either in Cove, Lynch's Quay, or to the quay in Cork City when the ship was brought upstream, with food, with clothing, and with water, free of charge. Local businesses chimed in. Blarney Woolen Mills, which is still a very successful woolen mills, donated a large amount of knitting wool for the passengers in order to knit. The Irish Red Cross then channeled these donations. We'll be coming to the role of the Red Cross in a second. There was a ceremony at City Hall where a presentation of the scroll with all the names of all the passengers, which presumably is somewhere in the archives in Cork. I haven't been able to locate it, but presumably it's somewhere in the archives in Cork, with thanks to the people of Cork, people of Ireland, and the government of Ireland. The children were taken on motor drives to the countryside and to the seaside. The taxi owners took the women and children on an excursion to Blarney Castle, and they all kissed the Blarney Stole and, of course, developed the gift of the gab. And this is a letter from the Irish Charge d'Affaires in Stockholm, as it were, indicating the feedback that had reached Sweden about the response that had occurred in Ireland. The voyage of the Victory from Gothenburg to Cork was prominently reported by the Swedish newspapers, and day-to-day accounts were given of the excellent reception which the emigrants received from the local inhabitants. Full accounts were given of the assistance given by the Irish Red Cross and of the efforts of the Lord Mayor of Cork to arrange alternative transport for the 450 people on board the ship. And again, I emphasise the point that this spontaneous generosity was occurring in a country where people could be excused for not being so generous simply because there was so little money going around. The principal vehicle through which the assistance was provided was the Irish Red Cross. And a very famous individual was chair of the Irish Red Cross, Leslie de Barra. She had fought in the 1916 Rising, the Irish Rising against British rule, which had taken place in 1916 and which had led to the Irish War of Independence. She had been director of conundrums, the Irish Women's Auxiliary of the IRA, which had fought the British during the War of Independence. She was the wife of Tom Barry, who was the most famous IRA commander during the War of Independence, who'd fought several engagements with the British and inflicted heavy casualties on them. So she was somebody who punched her weight and was a very formidable organiser. The Red Cross received no government funding directly, albeit Mrs. de Barra used her influence and the prestige of her name in order to engineer certain concessions from the government. So she wrote to the Taoiseach of the day, Johnny Costello, about a week after the arrival, just informed the government of what had been done, noting that the Minister of Defence had put a refugee camp at their disposal, noting the cost of maintaining the passengers per day, and there's 11 passengers who were able to, had the money and had the entry visas, had booked their airfares to Canada and were looking for government assistance. And after the break, we'll have a look at the form that assistance provided. A month later, she had noted at this point over £1,000 had been spent by the Society on maintaining the refugees. The Cork branch was no longer able to afford the cost of sustaining the refugees, and so the national organisation was being obliged to overtake. The supply of food was running short. The army was going to be asked to supply the refugees with army rations, and notified the government that the government would have to take over at some point if the situation wasn't resolved relatively quickly. Costello responded and said that the government was going to provide assistance. And then in January of 1950, perhaps a sign now that there were a number of problems emerging, she noted that some passengers had already made the onward journey, but many couldn't do so, either because they lacked the finance or because they lacked the entry visa. Not necessarily everyone who had an entry visa had the money to be able to afford the onward journey, which of course was going to be an awful situation. But some of those who had the money didn't have the entry visa either. For those who have been turned down for visas, a more delicate situation is arising. Some have mentioned, in inverted commas, the easy way out, the possibility of suicide for those who were finding themselves in this state of limbo. And she noted that she had reported this to the clergymen involved, either the Catholic or Lutheran clergymen and the police, to try and avoid that horrible scenario developing. This is a picture of Leslie de Barra. And just noting finally, before I think we've got this is the last slide before we take the break, just some of the other individuals. The Lord Mayor of Cork undertook a very active campaign of fundraising. A cheque for £500 was received from the Duke of Westminster, of all places. Dukes and earls were not necessarily soup du jour in Ireland, in Republican Ireland in those days, but the Duke of Westminster was moved to provide this very large donation by the plight of those. The Bishop of Cork and many other private donors supplied money. The City Hall offices were used as the base of the Red Cross operation. The City Medical Officer supplied his services free of charge. There was a suggestion that the new Irish shipping company, which had been established in the war, should be used to transport the refugees to Canada. And there was, on the 12th of October, pretty well all the major agencies in Cork, the political parties, the Red Cross, local health authorities, the churches, the Rotary Club, came together to organise a sustained campaign of fundraising for the Red Cross. And finally, just this point, that there was a film footage taken. This was the only national newsreel company sent a camera crew to document this local assistance. This was the first footage that this film corporation shot. As far as I'm aware, I think it's the only footage that it shot. I think it went out of business almost immediately. One little point to note here, that the person who shot this footage was an ex-Luftwaffe cameraman who'd been shot down over Ireland during the war and had been interned at the Curragh and hadn't returned to Germany. So hopefully we tested this sound beforehand, so hopefully you should be able to hear this.
The arrival of the former British landing craft Victory at Cork, carrying 385 refugees from the communist-controlled Baltic countries, aroused a storm of interest and indignation. The ship could carry 50 passengers with a certain degree of comfort, but nearly 400 overloaded her beyond safety point, apart from making conditions aboard almost indescribable. The Irish authorities had to face the question whether to allow her to cross the Atlantic or not, and in the meantime, a disused military camp nearby was put at the travellers' disposal. Nearly 100 children were among the refugees, who were mainly professional men with their families. Each one had paid £100 for this trip, which has been the source of heated arguments throughout the freedom-loving world.
So hopefully you heard that. We tested, Anders and I tested it beforehand, and it was audible. The refugee camp is just outside Cork. This is Cove, where the ship came in. This is Cork City, so it had come up through the harbour, and then the refugee camp was just established here outside Little Island. It opened in a camp in 1942, had just been vacated, so the rough facilities were there. So in October, the Army granted permission to the Red Cross to use the camp. The Army provided the bedding and the cooking equipment, with the main body of the passengers being transferred only the following day. So moved into the camp pretty quickly. The crew remained on board, and also some passengers also remained on board who were unwilling to leave. But they were told on the 24th of October that anybody who remained on board ship would not be given any further assistance as a means of making sure that all the refugees were kept in the one place. The Polish students who were studying in UCC, which I mentioned earlier, acted as interpreters. There was a three-man camp committee, one Pole, one Estonian, one Latvian, and they liaised with the Army and the Red Cross. The single women and those with families were accommodated in Rockgrove House, and the men were accommodated to a large extent in the prefabricated huts that had been used by the Irish Army. And there was a medical officer, and some rudimentary medical facilities were provided. A sick bay, an isolation ward, facilities for newborns were allocated separate rooms. This is, again, a report from the Free Estonian World. The sad story of the Victory is one of the most difficult chapters in the history of the cross-Atlantic journeys being made by the Viking boats. It becomes apparent from the letters that many have been left without any savings or opportunity to earn money. A lot of people, among them women and children, are being accommodated in coal barracks, and the result of poor food are now being taken ill, and as a result have become desperate. Even though Canadian immigration officials have visited the camp repeatedly and collected details about the passengers, which we'll be coming back to after the break, their destiny remains uncertain. Some individuals have turned to their countrymen in Canada to acquire an immigration visa. Taking into account the government's policies and regulation, it is hard to arrange anything more efficiently from here. If further travel should not be possible, the passengers shall be in utter despair. Many are lacking money, so they cannot even afford to buy a paper or a stamp for a letter. Immigration officials who have visited the camp seem primarily interested in individuals who have enough money to buy their own tickets to travel on regular passenger ships. So this is just, and we'll be coming back to the departures after the break, but this is sort of the point at which the Irish Red Cross ceased to have responsibility simply because it couldn't afford to do so in April and May of 1950. The general strain on the resources of the society, financially and otherwise, is considerable, but it is not the strain which has caused the executive to come to the decision. It mentions this is the extract where there was the minority of people who the Red Cross found difficult to work with. The committee is of the opinion that the refugees must, by means of temporary residence permits or otherwise, be brought under the laws of the ordinary inhabitants of the country. The committee would impress on the Taoiseach the importance of this being done at once, as undoubtedly they can't remain on the motor vessel Victory after the autumn, and there is no place in Cork to house them. The present system of indecision results in degeneration of the natural inclination among the majority of the refugees to fend for themselves. So most of those who could make the onward journey had already done so, and the Red Cross was saying at this point we have to move, as it were, on from a temporary situation to a more sort of medium-term solution and allow the people to find their own accommodation and to find their own work. Okay, we'll take the break. We'll take a break there. We'll stop sharing just for the moment. I'm conscious of the fact that we're already a little bit later than I planned. The good news is that the second half is shorter than the first. So I'll try to make sure that we're not finishing too late. But just, okay, Andrew, shall I begin again? Andrew, shall I begin again? Okay, yes, okay, sorry, you're on mute there. Okay, share screen. Okay, moving on now, as it were, away from the stories of the refugees or the localised response to looking at the international dimensions, because this very much was an international, not just a local or a personal episode, but an international event and an international issue. One of the first important official notes that we have is a memorandum produced by the Irish Department of Justice on the 17th of October. It noted the circumstances, which you've noted earlier on, by which the ship left Sweden and arrived in Cork. It said that when the boat arrived, the decision was taken to allow the passengers to get off. And of course, there was not necessarily an obligation on the Irish government to allow them to get off, because there had been no agreement that the ship would land, because it would have been inhuman to oblige them to remain on board. Noted the arrangements for the passengers at the refugee camp in Rockgrove. But the most important point was noting that the ship simply could not be allowed to proceed because it was unseaworthy. It just simply was not built for the type of journey which it was proposed to undertake, and the Irish government would be violating its international obligations if it allowed the ship to proceed. And the question that arose is, if the ship did decide to try and leave sort of in an unauthorised manner in the way that it had left from Gothenburg, what should the Irish Defence Forces do? We noted earlier on how sort of a token effort was put up by the Swedes to try and stop the ship departing Gothenburg. But the question then arose as to whether the Irish government should take more strenuous action to prevent it from leaving, given that it might be held responsible were anything to happen to the ship on the transatlantic journey. So it said, what should we do as a state? Well, it said that, first of all, encourage as many to leave the state as possible who could legally make the onward journey, given that that was their intention, to facilitate them in doing so. And for those who couldn't make that onward journey, either because they didn't have the money or they didn't have the entry rumours, to encourage them to help sustain themselves by taking up employment. With all such situations, there were rumours going around that there was sort of large amounts of money on board, gold bullion bars being secreted here, there and everywhere. The Garda searched the ship from top to bottom and found that the vast majority of those on board had absolutely no money at all. They basically had the clothes in which they were standing. 26 had sums ranging from $5 to $500, with a small number having credits in Canadian banks, but a maximum of 200 Canadian dollars. So none of those on board had really any money, and of course this is a reflection of the desperate state in which they'd made the journey. I just want to go back to the previous, can I go back? Yes, this is a screen I probably should have just wanted to begin with. This is the legal situation regarding the ship in terms of its seaworthy capacity. In 1929, you'd had an international convention signed. This was in the aftermath, of course, of all the tragedies that occurred in terms of sea crossings, like the Titanic, which of course left Cove before it made its final journey. One should note, of course, Cove had also been the site of the sinking of the Lusitania, which of course had been such a significant event during the First World War. So the basic summary was that there is an implied obligation on the state to prevent ships which do not satisfy the requirements of the Convention from putting to sea. That a government could not allow an unseaworthy ship to leave and should take steps to stop that happening. So this was sort of an extract from the relevant act. There had to be a surveyor of ships who would make an inspection and particularly see that the rules for life-saving appliances had been complied with, and that of course included lifeboats for everybody on board, which of course was impossible in this situation. If the surveyor finds that the rules for life-saving appliances have not been complied with, he shall give written notice to the owner or master, stating in what respect the said rules have not been complied with and what is in his opinion required to rectify the matter. Well, of course, in the case of the Victory, nothing could be done to rectify the matter. You simply couldn't get enough lifeboats on board for the 400 people on a ship that was designed for 50 people. Every notice should be communicated very, very clearly. And if a ship wished to leave and didn't make this change, then it should be detained until the corrections had been made. So, just coming back to this memorandum by the Department of Justice, passengers with means should be obliged to pay for upkeep in Muckrow, but of course, very few of them had the means to maintain themselves. Anyone who had a visa for Canada should be compelled to leave. If necessary, the state would subsidise that journey for those people who were legally allowed to make it because they had an entry visa into Canada. The Department of External Affairs was going to inquire if Latin American countries would wish to accept some of the passengers, with the possibility that the Irish state would charter a ship to facilitate that onward journey. So that's sort of an intriguing possibility that some of those on board might have ended up in places like Argentina or Brazil. Employment permits for those remaining should be granted freely, and as with the case with Canada, representation should be made to the Swedish government not to allow any more unseaworthy vessels to leave Sweden with refugees. Interestingly, the Irish Department of Justice has a very bad reputation in Ireland for a very hostile attitude towards refugees, but this is a very, very clear exception. This memo by the Department of Justice noted that Ireland had a poor record in accommodating refugees or displaced persons. So in the circumstances, the Minister suggests that we adopt a charitable attitude to these refugees, notwithstanding the fact that this may encourage other refugee ships to call here. So the Victory was seen as a somewhat of a special case, and the generally harsh line that the Irish government had taken towards admission of refugees up to that point should be waived in the context of this ship. Now, this is very, very interesting. We mentioned there about sort of what the Irish Department of Defence might do in the event of the ship trying to slip its moorings and making a surreptitious departure. So this is a memorandum from the Department of Industry and Commerce. The Minister considers that if the ship should leave her moorings at Cork and take to sea, some action should be taken to prevent her from getting away. The Irish government couldn't allow this to happen. The only action that appears feasible is that the Defence Forces should signal the ship to stop when she reaches Cove, and that if she doesn't obey, warning shots should be fired, either from the forts, two very huge forts, which were left over from the days in which Cove was a British naval base, or ignore the warning shots, from a naval vessel. If the ship should still choose to ignore the warning shots, no further action would be justified. It is realised that action on these lines might not prove effective in stopping the ship, but in the Minister's view, it would have the advantage, if the ship were subsequently lost, of showing that the ship did not make the comparatively long passage from Cork all the way down to the sea without any interference. It is understood that the Minister for Defence is prepared to give instructions for suitable action by the Defence Forces if the necessity should arise. And these are the instructions from the Irish Department of Defence. First of all, the vessel should be warned to stop by a signal from Horbolan, which is the Irish naval base in Cove. If the signal were ignored, a corvette could follow the Victory to sea within the limit of Irish territorial waters and fire a warning shot across her bows. The guns on a corvette are not suitable for firing blank ammunition, so the warning shot would have to be a live shell. So that live shell could not be fired in Cork Harbour. The coastal guns at Spike Island could not effectively be used to fire a blank warning shot at those which are as those are suitable for firing blank ammunition are not sighted to permit the firing across the bows of a vessel proceeding to sea. The angle at which those very large guns were set were such that they could not be used to send a warning shot. If the warning shot were not effective, the logical corollary would be to fire on the vessel itself, to, as it were, to fire with effect using live rounds to sink the vessel. It is presumed that any naval officer taking such action as might be ordered by the government would be indemnified against any successful claim that might be made by the master or owners or the passengers on the vessel, should the vessel be sunk. So a pretty horrendous prospect that the Irish government had to take into account the possibility and had to plan for the possibility that it might be necessary to sink the vessel in order, as it were, to save the passengers. The matter reached government level. So this is an extract from the Irish Cabinet on the 18th of October, and it considered all the various different memoranda that we've been considered. So a cabinet committee was established that would consider the matter. In the meantime, the police inspected the ship just to make sure that no bullion or anything else was being held on board, firearms or so on and so forth. And on the 19th of October, an order was made, in effect arresting the ship to prevent it legally from escaping. This meant that legally the ship could not escape. And this order was then tabled in Dáil Éireann in the Irish Parliament on the 2nd of November. So this is the order that was created. It said that no alien who arrived at the port of Cove on the 30th of September 1949 on the ship Victory shall leave the state without the permission of the chief superintendent. So all passengers were obliged to stay in the state. What about the ship? For the purposes enforcing paragraph 2 of this article, any member of the Garda Síochána of the Defence Forces may, if so requested by the chief superintendent, remove from the said ship Victory any part of its machinery which the chief superintendent specifies in the request. So the Irish government simply didn't trust the captain of the ship not to do what he'd done in Gothenburg. So the decision was taken in effect to disable the ship by removing part of the machinery. So the ship was then moved about 100 yards upriver. And this is now in St. Patrick's Quay. For any of you who know Cork, and I suspect very few of you do, but Merchants Quay Shopping Centre is directly opposite where the ship was berthed. The bridge under which it had passed was then closed behind it to make sure that the ship couldn't make an unauthorised dash for the sea. So it was kept in Cork behind a bridge. The question then arose, should it be paying harbour dues? But the decision was, of course, taken that this wasn't appropriate. So in terms of the cabinet then decided that what should be done? Well, the decision was taken to invite the Canadian government to inspect the refugees, given that that's where they wanted to go, to see how many, if any, could be allowed to make the journey and how. And then there was also the decision about maintaining the camp at government expense via the Red Cross. So the next memorandum was prepared by the Department of Justice in December. And this was the conclusions of the departmental committee that had been originally established. It said that the state couldn't undertake the cost of funding a scheme to transport the refugees from Ireland unless it becomes clear that the refugees cannot pay their own way and they couldn't be absorbed into Irish employment here. Why? Well, why couldn't the Irish government? Well, one, many Irish citizens would then say, well, if you're transporting Estonians and Poles and Lithuanians free of charge to Canada, why don't you do the same for us? And secondly, the belief was that if the Irish government did adopt this policy of subsidising or paying for the onward journey, that this would encourage new refugees to make the journey from Sweden to Ireland. It noted that only about 70 of the refugees had enough money to pay fares, but few of those refugees had entry visas into Canada, and most of those that had the entry visas didn't have enough money to make the journey. It mooted the possibility of selling the ship. At that point, it noted, to put it mildly, the complex ownership arrangements and we'll be coming back to those later on because a court case is taken regarding same. So of the 300 people who are remaining, they should be encouraged to take up employment. And it said that the Irish Red Cross, anybody who refused to work, the Irish Red Cross should stop supporting them in the refugee camp. So it said that there are a number of possibilities that employment could be found. The Earn Hydroelectric Scheme, cutting turf, agricultural labourers, domestic servants. Of course, the problem was that there was a very high level of unemployment in Ireland at the time and a very high level of underemployment, which is the reason why, of course, tens of thousands of people were leaving. So it's not like as if Ireland then, as now, had large numbers of jobs. It was one of the poorest countries in Europe, and it was a place from which people emigrated to find work rather than arrived to take up work. The Department of Foreign Affairs suggested one possibility, which was to send the ship and the passengers back to Sweden, but noted that Sweden was unlikely to accept them because it was desperately trying to get rid of the refugees. Continuing this memorandum, so it said, what should the recommendations be? First of all, the state shouldn't undertake the responsibility of transporting the refugees. That was the refugees' own job, and the refugees should be so informed. The refugees should be either told to work or make arrangements to leave the country. The government to assist them in trying to find work, which of course was not necessarily easy. The Red Cross was asked to facilitate those who were able to make the journey, to use its good offices to contact shipping companies to make sure that these journeys could be undertaken at the lowest possible cost. And anybody who refused work that was offered, the Irish Red Cross would cease to provide them free maintenance. So the government took the decision that it would continue for the time being to fund the refugee camp being paid for by the Red Cross, to reimburse the Red Cross. But the society should be informed that the making of a grant in this particular instance does not imply the acceptance of a principle of any obligation by the state to refund the society any expenditure which it might incur in respect of refugees in general. So again, the victory has made a special case. This isn't setting a precedent, and the government is keen to emphasise that any other refugees who arrive will not necessarily be entitled to the same treatment. Later on in December, the refugees were going to be informed that they would not be allowed to leave on the Victory. Under no circumstances would the Victory be allowed to sail because it wasn't able to make the journey, and the Irish government would be held responsible for any untoward incidents were it to make the attempt. So that those who remained would either have to stay, which was the government didn't particularly want, because of course it had its own problems. So it wished to encourage them to leave, preferably without state funding. So the IRC was asked to encourage the refugees to leave, and again, not assist anybody who refused to do so. And thereafter, the matter was taken not so much at cabinet level, as had been the case over the previous 2 months, but at simply departmental level. Okay, now moving on to the Canadian situation. The Canadian government, of course, as we mentioned, didn't recognise the annexation of Estonia by USSR. So at least that was one sort of positive sign, is that the Estonian nationals were recognised as Estonian nationals and not as citizens of the Soviet Union. And there was an Estonian consulate in Canada, which helped facilitate the departure of the Estonians to Canada. Ireland at that point didn't enjoy diplomatic relations with Estonia. Ireland was a very small, a very, very small diplomatic corps at that point. So most countries, most states, Ireland didn't have diplomatic relations. And of course, it also enabled the Irish government to avoid making any tricky decisions as to whether to recognise the Soviet annexation or not. It almost certainly wouldn't have done so because the Irish government was probably the most anti-Soviet government in Western Europe at the time. It, for example, was the last government to afford recognition to the Polish communist government as late as 1962, and long after the Americans and the British had ceased recognising the Polish government in exile, the Irish government continued to do so. So we here have a letter from the Estonian consul to Canada from Hanaldino. Well, he was one of the early departees to Canada, so he's writing from a refugee camp in Toronto. He outlined the circumstances in which the Cardiff Syndicate, which had been responsible for purchasing the Victory, had come into being, and he noted the circumstances which had led to its departure, that the captain had threatened to leave at very short notice as soon as the opportunity arrived, which forced all the passengers who were intending to make the journey on board and stay on board, which meant that many of the refugees who had jobs and apartments had to leave them sort of at a moment's notice in order to get on board. So on the 27th of August, 150 got on board, and more, of course, got on board until you had 380 plus. The 28th of August, the syndicate, there was a debt still owing on the Victory, and there was allegations that members of the syndicate had been engaged in fraud. And this is the reason why additional passengers had to be accepted on board. I think the plan initially was that it should be limited to Estonians and perhaps Lithuanians and Latvians, but a large number of Poles had to be accepted on board as paying passengers in order to complete the purchase of the Victory. The complaint was made that the Irish government was threatening to sell the Victory and use the proceeds to send on all passengers who had obtained, that should say, Canadian visas rather than Canadian passports. He was saying that this is not an Estonian problem, that the problem was made by the Poles on board because they were the ones who were complaining to the Irish government and making demands which the compliant Estonians weren't doing. And as far as Hanaldino was concerned, this step would be the equivalent of taking the ship from the Estonians by force by the Irish government if it decided simply to seize the vessel, to pay it in order to fund the onward journey. So he was asking the Estonian consul in Canada for help for those who remained. Of course, it was practically impossible for the Estonian consul to do anything because it had very little money. It was operating, in effect, without an authorised government back in Estonia. So the suggestion was that as the ship was recognised as Norwegian and registered there, that the Norwegian consulate should be asked to step in to assist in funding the journey. And he also quoted a New York Times report that Canadian visas had been issued. And here we have the reference from that in the New York Times. This is part of a broader range of references in the international press to both the arrival of the ship and the ongoing dilemma as to what to do with the passengers at this point, 2 months after their arrival. Moving on now to Sweden's Stockholm, from AAUN, the Canadian representative in Stockholm, back to Ottawa. He had asked the captain of the ship to visit the delegation, but had failed to do so. As we mentioned earlier on, he had told the captain what the requirements of the Canadian government was, which was don't sail. He expressed doubt that the warning would have any effect, and he believed that the ship would sail undoubtedly in the near future, which of course wasn't quite the case. It was another 2 months, or slightly less, before it did so, but it was clearly departure was on its mind. Another part communication from the director of the Canadian Immigration Branch to the Minister for Immigration. The view was that to admit those immigrants who were in good health and who passed the security examination. The Victory now at Cork will be arriving at Halifax within the next 2 weeks, and we propose to deal with her passengers in accordance with the above. But of course, that wasn't going to be the case because almost on the same day, the Irish government took the decision that, to arrest the ship and to make sure that it couldn't make the onward journey. And of course, this was going to make the matter more complicated. So the acting Canadian High Commissioner, Canada did have diplomatic relations with Ireland at the time, both members. Sorry, Ireland had left the Commonwealth at this point. To Sean McBride. Sean McBride was the son of another famous veteran of the 1916 Rising, one of those who had been executed by the British, and also Maud Gonne, W.B. Yeats's beloved. So Sean was the son of that marriage, a rather unhappy marriage, and he became the Irish foreign minister, and he was the foreign minister who had to deal with this issue. So here's the point at which the Canadians informed the Irish government that with the Irish government's permission, it proposed to send a team to Cork in order to try and resolve the logjam. If the Irish government would not allow anybody who the Canadians didn't want to travel. So this was one of the requirements, that anyone to whom the Canadians said no, the Irish government would also say no. They requested full facilities be given to the team, and that the Irish would supply any medical information they had on the refugees, including any x-rays. This was, of course, to check for things like tuberculosis. Anybody who had tuberculosis, simply that was a no-no. No one had a chance of travelling on. The Canadian government made clear that it had no responsibility for meeting any travel costs, which of course it didn't have. Of course, neither did the Irish government. A newspaper interview being given with the minister informed that the Victory would not be permitted to leave, and the refugees would be examined by Irish and Canadian officials to prevent lengthy detention at Halifax and the hardship involved in returning inadmissible immigrants to Europe. So anybody who's making the journey will be allowed in pretty well straight away, won't be kept when they arrive in Cork, but nobody who isn't suitable for making the journey will be allowed to do so, because at least that prevented the difficult decision of turning them back. Again, some more diplomatic correspondence. Following discussion between the Irish and the Canadian governments, facilities have been made available for the Canadian officials to examine the refugees. So in December, the outcome of the Canadian assessment was made known. Of the 343 refugees who still remained, at this point, about 40 had already made the onward journey. These are the people who'd had the money to make the journey and had entry visas. 223 were granted. So that was a huge proportion. It meant that, roughly speaking, 260, 270 of the original 380 would be going on to Canada, either had already gone or would be going. And 99 were also being further considered. There was some question mark over whether these would be allowed to make the journey on medical grounds. We really believe that about 2/3 of them would. 12 definitely refused on medical grounds. 12 adults and 7 children would also be refused as they were their dependents. And 15 were refused on security grounds. These were people who, against whom a question mark existed as far as Canada was concerned about their war record. Canada, of course, had been a belligerent in the Second World War, so any individual who was considered to have served in the German army or perhaps collaborated during occupations were considered to being unsuitable. So 3 Estonians, 2 Poles, 2 Belarusians, 1 Lithuanian, and the others were the children of these adults. Interestingly, no communists, none of these were communists as such, but they were deemed to have been collaborated with the Germans. The Irish government and the Irish Gardaí regarded the degree of collaboration involved as being at the lower end of the scale, but of course Ireland hadn't been a belligerent, so it didn't have the difficulty of explaining to the Canadian population, some of whom would have lost their sons in the war, why it was that it was allowing what was seen to be German collaborators into Poland. The Canadians, as far as the Irish were concerned, had very little evidence against them, but refused visas because they didn't want to take any risks. Interestingly, some of those who were not granted visas somehow found the money in order to make the journey. I'm not quite sure, I presume that they made their way into Canada by hook or by crook, legally or illegally. Okay, again, we haven't got too much more now, but again, just running through some of the international dimensions. The Swedish Chargé d'Affaires in Dublin. A letter from the Swedish Chargé d'Affaires back to the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Again, this is sort of early on the 11th of October. No official criticism by the Irish government against the Swedish authorities, but he noted anecdotal testimony that the Swedes had let the refugees disappear from their shores. The Irish authorities are concerned over the unregulated invasion of people who cannot be absorbed into employment, but will cost the state in efforts to move them on. We've considered some of those aspects already. The Cork Lord Mayor has spoken about his concern after a published interview with an Estonian passenger. This passenger warns that more ships with refugees are to be expected, as thousands of Baltic people in Sweden and Germany are fleeing an imminent war with Russia. It would be appreciated if Swedish authorities could share their views on this exodus of Baltic people and what measures will be taken to regulate same. So as with all refugee situations, there's uncertainty as to how many people are involved, and as we know now, but couldn't be known at the time, that there was a fear that this was the first part of a wave of immigration. As it turns out, of course, this is the last major so-called Viking ship that made the journey. And later on, following week in October, the Chargé d'Affaires requested details of the refugees from the Irish authorities in order to make sure that the Swedes could remove those refugees from their own register of aliens, because, of course, again, the Swedes didn't know who'd left on board the ship. The Chargé d'Affaires had met the Canadian High Commissioner and exchanged a few words with him regarding the Baltic refugees. He informed he had 4 staff placed in Cork investigating whether Canadian immigration rules can apply. Usually takes about a month. He promised to forward a list of those approved of Canadian citizenship as soon as possible. He also said he had had a conversation with Foreign Minister Sean McBride, informing him that Canada would accept those refugees considered suitable. However, she would not contribute financially to the transport. McBride said the Irish government was still dealing with the issue, but had yet to come to a decision. And Mr Johnston, the Canadian High Commissioner in Dublin, said it was hard on Ireland to be stuck with these refugees. Just a sort of an illustration of some of the personal difficulties involved. A refugee on board the ship who held a Swedish alien passport. One of the Baltic refugees had a Swedish alien passport, has expressed the wish to return to Sweden, which according to today's telegram from the Swedish authorities has been denied. As it can be predicted that refugees who cannot enter Canada or any other country will want to return to Sweden, it is assumed that this is a sign that Swedish authorities are in principle against the return of those refugees. So the idea was that the refugees who remained in Ireland would not want to stay because there really was no work for them, however warm the initial welcome. But it seemed from this communication that the Swedish authorities wouldn't allow them to return either. So they couldn't go on to Canada, they couldn't go on to any other country, they couldn't go back to Sweden. Even those who had an entry visa or a Swedish alien passport weren't going to be allowed back, which of course increased the likelihood that some of them would have to remain in Ireland. It noted some of the further details. His wife is seriously ill, which is the reason why he wished to return. An investigation, or at least that was the purported story. An investigation has shown that Aras has not retired for permission to return to Sweden or for travel documents prior to his departure. His wife was found to be in good health. On these grounds, his application is denied. The decision should not be interpreted as reflecting the policy that all such applications will be denied, but rather each application will be decided on its merits. So the individual clearly just didn't want to remain in Cork. He was sick of being stuck in limbo and told a little white lie, as it were, that his wife was ill, which he wasn't, as a means of getting back to Sweden. So this was a debate in the Swedish Parliament. This isn't necessarily specifically with reference to the victory, but of course, this being in November 1949, the case of the victory was very much to the forefront. I believe there is nothing wrong with implementing the policy of returning illegal refugees in the boats in which they arrive, provided they are seaworthy or that there is no risk to their lives or health. The Commission was united in the decision to return refugees. In this case, this is a previous instance. Finally, it has to be said that an uncontrolled immigration policy could have negative effects on the labour market. If it is known that we, as opposed to Denmark, for example, do not return any refugees to the eastern zone, there may be a sharp increase in numbers of people seeking entry here. We would not be able to provide these people housing or employment, but may have to organise camps where these people would have to reside, as of course had happened in Ireland. I find it hard to believe that we would feel good about such arrangements, and I would not think that the refugees themselves would accept such circumstances. So it's clear that the victory has left Sweden at pretty much the right time. Opinion is moving very hard in Sweden against what was seen as Sweden being a soft touch for people who were leaving, had left the other countries. And it's pretty clear that the Swedes were planning some form of a crackdown to try and to resolve the issue and force the emigrants to leave. Okay, so these are the details of the Onward channel. How did the Lutherans leave? Well, in fact, they're subsidised with the Lutheran World Federation. In effect, provided funding for those Lutherans who weren't able to make the journey themselves. It was very high praise for the work of the Irish Red Cross, and Leslie de Barra in particular. And there is the letter from the Lutheran World Federation in England praising the work that had been done. And the Vatican Migration Bureau contributed to the fares for the Catholics, particularly, of course, the Poles who were on board. So we have here a schedule of those who departed. The first departures were on the 11th of November. So only about 6 weeks after arrival, 13 adults and 2 children flew from Shannon Airport. This was one of the early transatlantic flights from Shannon Airport. Most of those, however, who then made the onward journey sailed. I'm not quite sure how some of them, they're registered as sailing from Manchester, which of course is inland, so I'm not quite sure exactly how that was arranged, but you see here that the small groups are leaving, and then a very large group in April 1950. Interestingly, as had happened previously, one stowaway, an Irish stowaway, it seems tried to get on board the ship with the passengers trying to get over to Canada. Here we have a picture of the first group to leave. This is taken in Cork railway station, and the thing that really strikes me here is just how well dressed they are. These were the days of the Sunday best, and however penniless people were, there always seemed to be the possibility of at least one decent coat or skirt or pair of pants and a tie. Okay, reception in Canada. The first place that they stayed when they arrived was in Camp Ajax in Toronto. April 1950, the chairman of the Estonian Union in Canada and a member of the management of the Toronto Estonian Club visited, welcomed the Estonians who had arrived from Ireland. A small concert was given to the camp visitors by the children's choir, led by little Hervé Supera, who herself played a violin. It became apparent in April 1950 that the majority of the Victory's Estonian passengers had already made their way to Canada. 32 Estonians were left in Cork, and of these, only some had any hope of subsequently getting a visa. Some had to travel back to Sweden on mostly medical grounds. So that was from in 1970, a report in 1970. So these are some of the refugees that for those who couldn't make the onward journey or were refused or for medical reasons, this is what they did in Cork. So we have here a list of occupations. So nationality, Estonian, Edelson Valdemar. He was employed by a painter and decorator, as was Heinrich Lviv and Vladimir Laula, the same company. A carpenter, an upholsterer, cabinet maker, machinist, furniture manufacturers. You can see a number of the individuals involved had some facility in dealing with wood. So carpenters, cabinet makers, and the like. Some of the women were employed as domestic servants. I've actually looked at some of these houses. This house still certainly exists in Bishopstown, and others agricultural labourers as farmhands, mechanics, and I think this is the fellow who we mentioned at the very beginning, who had some facility as a car mechanic, and he found work in Cork as a car mechanic. Some of the others. This man, my father-in-law, knew. 2 Russian army men, a Finn and a Pole, who failed to get to Canada from the refugee ship in Cork, are now working for Bord na Móna, a Bora in County Offaly. Bord na Móna was the company which established to cut peat or turf. Ireland doesn't really have any coal, so this is the equivalent. And one of these Russians then went on to work for the electricity company in Ireland, and he worked with my father-in-law. When I mentioned the work I was doing, he said I knew that man. He didn't work directly with him, but he knew of him because they were both employed by the electricity board. Another Russian, Arkady Romanovsky, a newspaper report there where he had served in the Russian army, the Soviet army, the Red Army, training dogs to detect explosives, and he found a stray dog in Ireland and tried to teach him the same thing. Okay, so resolution. Moving on now to the whole thing is resolved. We've dealt with the passengers. The passengers, by degrees, either for the most part make their way to Canada, with a small number in effect either having to find occupation in Ireland or ultimately going on elsewhere. But what about the ship? In December 1949, it was revealed that there were 60 shareholders in Cork on board the ship and another 3 in Norway. So they decided to sell the ship. In effect, I think strongly because they didn't want the Irish government to sell it under their feet as a means of recouping the cost. They expected to get about €17,000, but the problem is that once they paid off the crew wages and all the costs of the repairs, there simply wasn't enough money for those on board to make the onward journey. And then there was added difficulties of identifying just exactly who was a shareholder, how much and what value of shares each held, because of the difficult circumstances in which the syndicate had come into being, and the fact that the shareholders are scattered in various different locations, communication practically impossible. So in April 1950, a court case was taken in Irish courts by 60 passengers against the owners for breach of contract. These are largely, to a large extent, the people who'd paid their way, weren't the owners, but were expecting to get to Canada and sued the people who they'd given the money to for passage because they weren't in Canada. So in November 30th, 1950, the case was heard at Cork Circuit Court. One of the plaintiffs alleged that the ship was unseaworthy, which of course it was, and this meant that money had been taken from them under false pretenses. One of the defendants, who was one of the owners, said the plaintiff knew that the journey on board the ship was illegal and knew that the ship didn't have all the necessary documentation. His defence was that the ship was unseaworthy, partly because of the great number of persons, including the plaintiff, who desired to be carried illegally, a rather intriguing legal defence, and also because the ship struck rocks after its departure. So this was the defence, that it was seaworthy when it left port, and to the extent to which it was overcrowded because passengers were making the journey illegally. The case was deferred with the suggestion that the ship would be sold. Some refugees continued on board as late as September 1951, 2 years later, when an attempt was made simply to resolve the matter by buying the ship and ensuring that the refugees would then have to find accommodation. Everybody but one left the ship on the receipt of the offer. One Estonian disputed the sum offered, believed that he was entitled to more. So a Norwegian crew attempted to set sail, cast off from the moorings, and the tug moved the boat into the middle of the channel in Cork from its moorings where it had been for 2 years. But typical of the misadventures which had dogged the ship since its departure from Gothenburg, at that precise moment, the police and customs men arrived and shouted to the captain that the boat was under arrest. Again, the bridge which had been opened to allow the ship to leave was shut again very quickly to stop the boat leaving, and it had to go back to its moorings. And ultimately, in October 1951, the case was dismissed in the Irish High Court. So finally, the ship leaves, or attempts to leave. This is an extract from the Irish Times. The vessel flying the Norwegian flag with a crew of 7 Norwegians on board was piloted down the river by a Cork harbour pilot. However, the vessel berthed again in the lower harbour in order to set her compass, and it was expected she would not resume the voyage pending detailed weather reports. So even when it had permission to leave, and even when it was on the point of departure, the ship is stopped because it frankly doesn't know where it's going, and finally makes the onward journey to wherever it was going sometime later. Okay, almost at the end now, and again I have an eye on the clock that we're almost at 11 o'clock Irish time, and nearly 2 hours in. This is a letter that was sent to me. I sent letters to the local press here in Cork, asking for anybody who had memories of what had happened in the refugee camp. And a priest who has since died, a very famous priest here in Cork, Father James Good, sent me a letter. He said, when the camp was occupied, whether by our soldiers or refugees, relations with the local people were very good. Many local people supplied the refugees with food and other essentials. A personal link, he was ordained in 1948 and spent 2 years studying in Cork, studying for a degree in theology. A number of the Polish priests who were also studying there took him down to the camp because he was chaplain to the Poles, and he provided spiritual and other assistance to the Poles in the camp. This is a published memoir of somebody who grew up in Cork, and some of the details are incorrect, but it's an interesting recollection of somebody later on in life of something which had happened when he was very young. In late summer of 1949, a large overcrowded boat pulled up at Lynch's Quay. I was 7 years of age. On board were hundreds of adults and children of all ages. Frail and badly clothed, they spoke a foreign language. Many years were to pass before I learned the real significance of what I'd witnessed. The Viking boat Victory was detained in Cork for minor repairs on its way to Canada. 372 illegal displaced persons were on board. Temporary military camps, one camp were erected for them in Rockgrove, Little Island in East Cork. The refugees were humanely segregated into nationality groups. Gifts were given to them from the people of Cork. Canadian and Irish government officials worked to rectify the plight of the refugees. Sean McCarthy, the Lord Mayor, interceded on their behalf. I had been a 7-year-old witness to one of the last human flights to freedom from post-war-torn Europe. This is probably the most moving piece of folk memory. Sean Dunn was a very prominent, very famous, very good poet here in Cork. He died tragically, must be about 20 years ago now, at a young age. But he wrote a poem in honour of the passengers on board the Victory. So I'll try and do it justice. I'm not somebody who has got a particularly good voice for recital, but I'll try my best. We were sick of seeing the liners leave with our own day in, day out. So when the boats came with refugees to Cove, it was worth the fare to travel from Cork to glimpse them on railed decks. They seemed like ourselves, which became disappointing. Their clothes were different. Dark coals and scarves like shawls, shoes heavy as anvils. Their talk thickened, accents the sounds of rocks, crumbling and crunching in quarries. Latvia, a word to spill. We pushed pins in the names of their towns and regions, a homeland rife with altered borders. They hadn't a word of English, but we gave what we could. Sheets and ration tea, sweets, blankets, bread, bottles of stout. One night they sang for hours and we heard their songs pour over the islands, not one of us knowing the words. That music stayed in the mind afterwards. I can still see the lights of Holbolan shimmering as songs broke among the waves. And afterwards moonlight fell on silence, a flotsam of quiet like a bombed shore. So strange to see emigrants to Ireland huddled near posters telling us to leave the broken farms from Manhattan streets. It became like Ellis Island, hunched lines of foreigners with bundles staring at the grey cathedral, the terraces of houses curved like icing around hills where handkerchiefs fluttered. In time we turned them away. Most stood steady as cattle when the ship drew out with pilot boats trailing after it, kittens drawn after a mother coat. Without them, there was one less thing to do, one reason less to stay and stare at the ocean choking on words for home. Okay. To conclude, we need to do more work. Certainly I need to do more work. There are archives in Ireland that I haven't yet been able to consult, largely because of COVID, and certainly archive material in Canada. Of course, the problem is more difficult for the home countries of the passengers involved. Estonian archives, Latvia, Lithuania, of course, the archive situation is very difficult because of the annexation of those countries, and it's very difficult to obtain details, as far as I'm aware, for Poles, the Poles and Finns on board. Again, given certainly in the Polish case that the country was subject to communist rule. Where are they now? Well, I don't know where the ship is. For all I know, the ship is still ploughing the ocean waves somewhere. I don't know where it ended up. I know that it was taken over by Norwegians, but whether it went to Norway or anywhere else, I don't know. I don't know what the lifetime of a ship is. So who knows? It might still be out there. Where are they now? Well, the refugees, of course, some of the people who are listening to this talk know where they are. But what I would be particularly interested in is finding the descendants of those who were forced to remain in Ireland and elsewhere. Not, of course, suggesting that the story of those who made it to Canada isn't important, but thankfully, as a result of this communication, we're able to establish that link and get some more details. But it'd be interesting and worthwhile to try and complete the story of all those who were involved and to see where they all ended up. Okay, finally, my assessment. I wouldn't exaggerate the significance of the victory episode. The numbers on board all the Viking boats, if you take them in total and add the victory in, were a tiny fraction of the post-war European refugees to the New World, a fraction of 1%. This wasn't, of course, as we already mentioned, the first time an Irish government had to deal with one of the Viking boats. And the government also accepted a limited number of these refugees from war-torn Europe, accepted a number of, for example, German orphans into Ireland. But the duration of the problem, 2 years, the range of issues involved, both domestic and international, involving maritime law, humanitarian considerations, the Cold War situation, the emotional symbolism of coffin ships coming in to Ireland 100 years after the end of the famine, meant that the incident most certainly was significant from an Irish perspective. There were problems. I mean, the situation, we know now, of course, that the hot war never broke out, that Sweden never did fall under Soviet rule or Soviet influence or Soviet occupation, but nobody at the time could have known that. So the situation was very fluid, very threatening, seeming to be going in the wrong direction. And bearing that in mind, I find it difficult to think that, find fault with anybody involved. I think everybody, every agency, practically every individual behaved within the limits of their circumstances sort of pretty admirably. The refugees behaved very well. There is no report of any widespread misbehaviour. There are individual exceptions which we've already noted. But the refugees did not create any difficulties. They were grateful for the assistance they were receiving. The Swedish government, as we've already noted, didn't really meaningfully obstruct their departure. Of course, I think they were pretty glad to see the departure of the refugees because they still had many left. The Canadian government, I think, should be congratulated for their willingness to grant new entry visas where they weren't obliged to do so, and where they didn't grant entry visas, for example, in the case of security grounds or health grounds, they had perfectly valid reasons for doing so. I think the Irish government, considering the position in which the Irish government found itself, a disastrous, a catastrophic economic situation with massive immigration, massive employment and underemployment, very little money coming into government coffers. This placed a sort of severe constraints on what the Irish government could do. But it did what it could. It underwrote the cost of maintaining maintaining the refugees for the duration of their stay in the camp, and it helped those who needed work visas to get them and to place them where they could sustain themselves. And certainly as far as Cork is concerned, the spontaneous local response from individuals and agencies here in Cork, the local authorities, the local government, the local council, the Red Cross, trade unions, political parties and the like, there seemed to be absolutely nothing but praise from the refugees involved for what they did. So I'll leave that with one final thought, bearing in mind our current predicament. The people on board the ship had to face a lot worse situation than being in the middle of a pandemic and having to socially distance and maintain masks. They were fleeing for their lives with barely the clothes that they had on their backs. And yes, notwithstanding all the difficulties of the international situation, practically everybody involved seemed to do the right thing. And I think that's a sort of rather heartwarming point on which we can finish the talk and take some questions.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was amazing. For such a comprehensive overview of a remarkably complex situation. That it was a fascinating tale, and you've done a really extensive research and sort of outlined how much more there is still to do.
There is.
Hopefully some of the people who are in our Zoom meeting at the moment have at least some personal experience and reflections that they can share.
Can I have 1 second? I just want to get a pen because I want to take these down. Okay, pen ready.
I have a question. I'm in California, so I have to hit the beach, you know. So I was a 3-year-old on the ship, and I have a share document that my father signed for 1 share of the ship.
Excellent.
For $560. What's confusing me is it was dated in Cork, Ireland, October the 29th, 1949. They were already there.
Yeah.
I don't understand why he would have had a share document then.
Because my understanding, and again, there may be other people here who are able to give a better answer than I can. My understanding is that the circumstances surrounding the ownership of the ship, and this is where the court case is relevant, were uncertain. There was no sort of register of owners because the people who were owning it were refugees who were desperately trying to get out of Sweden. A lot of it was done on word of mouth, not necessarily any documents being issued. So the fact that that document is issued in Cork isn't altogether surprising, because there simply may not have been the time for that share certificate to have been issued before the departure, because it may have been that was it your father?
My father. Yeah, it was my father.
Yeah,
He must have paid the money in Sweden then and gotten the share document in Cork. Does that make any sense?
That seems to be logical. Again, there may be others who are more experts. I haven't got as yet the court documents for the case, but I will get them. I was quoting.
I'll be happy to send you a copy of the share document.
Well, and just generally for people, what I should say is that we are hoping to make a documentary about the story. I think it's a great story. I think it has so many different levels. It's sort of transatlantic. It's sort of within Europe. It is a story of individuals in great difficulty. It has very clear contemporary resonances, certainly here in Europe, where, of course, a fresh refugee wave was occurring across the Mediterranean in recent years. So one of the people who are on this call is a documentary filmmaker here in Cork, an award-winning documentary filmmaker. And we are desperate to get in contact with everybody who may have information, because we're aware that as much as information as I've given there, that's, I think, only at the most half the story. At the absolute most, the experience of the passengers is something which I have almost no information about. As you can see, I was quoting in a couple of cases from Canadian websites, but the first-hand experience of those who are on board, or perhaps the children of those who are on board.
May I tell you, Gabriel? I have my mother's diary. And one of the anecdotes she stated was, when the ship left Sweden, and she said they were shot at twice.
Yeah.
And they kept near the shore because nobody had piloted there before. And whoever the captain was, he stayed near the shore. They got to the English Channel, and it was blockaded by the Royal Navy. And she said there were boats going in all different directions. Nobody knew what to do. And some guys in a dinghy from the ship went to a Royal Navy ship to ask for directions. And the captain said,
go that way.
History of the Royal Navy, has anybody ever done that?
Very good. What I'll do, I will put up my email address and any other contact details at the end. And anything, it would be absolutely fantastic. If there's anyone has any it doesn't have to be a question. It could be observations or memories. I mean, almost by definition, everybody here has some sort of contact. So I'd love to hear from as many people as wish to speak.
If I could say something about the walnut, which I know more about, the Pier 69 over in Halifax has quite a bit of documentation, which I've been able to see, and there were some protests from Sweden on accepting the refugee ship. So there's a letter to the minister in Canada from Swedish communists, and Swedish communists did get a substantial share of the vote, and that was another thing that was driving the Estonians out.
Yes.
And they said to the Canadian authorities that they shouldn't accept this ship because there are all these fascists on board.
Yeah.
And so, but my father, who was on that ship, he said that a couple of Estonian young men were sent back to Sweden. The reason for them being sent back to Sweden was because they had married Swedish women and they had to go back to fulfill their marital obligations.
Okay. Yes, that makes sense, yeah. Of course, as we mentioned on the Victory, there was a woman who didn't want to go back, didn't want to be reunited with their husband. Thank you very. Is it Michael?
Come back, yes.
Okay. Again, I apologise for my complete and total inability to pronounce Estonian names or any other words. Apologies.
Problem.
Gabriel.
Mal, how are you keeping?
Yes, my father was the bird salesman, and the men actually were making, I have two of these birds flown to Canada, and the men actually set up a workshop in the hold of the ship, and the men were making the birds, and my father was the salesman that went out on the streets, and I could never figure out that what housewife on the street who was terribly poor could afford to be buying wooden birds for her house, unless it was out of sheer charity.
I mean, the newspaper report that accompanied that picture saying he went to every house in Cork. I mean, he just went, because he didn't have anything else to do, he had to try and sell his wares. So, I mean, it wasn't necessarily always the poor people. In some cases, you had slightly sort of richer people who were buying them, you know, as a memento or as part of the contribution. But those wood carvings, again, somebody else who contacted me on foot of the letter I put in the newspaper said they remembered your father going door to door in Cork, selling, and it was noted that the robots, he painted them silver, and they had their, obviously very simple, just their arms and legs going up and down, and apparently they were very much in demand for the children of Cork at the time. So, but to see that you still have some, and you can see in the picture, I'll just put that picture back up, and you'll see that the wood carving. Oh, sorry, I just have to. The wood carving has
the toys that you pull by a string were called ampelman.
Here he is. So just so you can see there. That's the bird, and we'll leave that there now. And so, Mal, could you put that bird up again, and you can see that they're exactly the same. That's whatever 70, 80 years in between. Fantastic.
Piret, coming to your place.
Yeah, the voice is slightly cracking up there, Mal, so I don't hear absolutely everything. But we're in email contact anyway, so I'm sure we can build on that. If anyone else has any observations or questions or comments,
I do. I have some. I recognize some people in some of your photos.
yeah.
In particular, you have a very good photo of my mother, and it just tears much my eyes to see it. And
Yes.
there's a picture of two women sort of looking at something as though they're reading something. And
Okay.
the woman is beside her is Agnes Barango, who is there as the athlete. That's her wife, and as it happens, my parents were very good friends with the Barangos. And the Barangos were also on that list of people who couldn't leave. Yes, so on the right side,
Yes.
first picture on the left, that is Agnes Palanko. And the next picture is my mother, who is Linda Ernitz. And then I picture the children, the young children. If you can put that up, there's this, like a few pictures later, there's a row of children.
Yes. Just here.
No, one, yeah. So the little boy on the far left, the one with the, yes, that is Toivo Palanko, who is Victor and Agnes's son, their only son.
Okay.
And parents were very good friends with them, and they stayed in contact with them their entire lives. They ended up in Los Angeles, lived there, very successful there. They visited us in Canada once, and since the parents died, I don't know. They still have a son there. I don't have addresses for them.
Okay.
Anyway, I just wanted to say too that I loved your presentation. All the details that I know. I was on the ship myself, but I don't remember too much. My parents, of course, told us a lot when we were young, to the point where, we didn't want to hear it. We were like young kids. We wanted to get on with lives in Canada. But what I do remember of the tales they told, it's consistent with everything that you have provided, but you have given me so much more information. I just had, a few snap memories, and the few little anecdotes I remember that my parents told me. So this is really very nice to me. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for that. I mean, it's fascinating to me. I say it's one of those points where sort of European history and Canadian history has this juncture point with Ireland. Ireland at this point was considered to be quite isolated from the world, which of course it wasn't. Of course, it was buffeted by the winds of current affairs, the same as everywhere else. But it was considered to be quite an introspective country. Very in self-referential, not really interested in what was going on out in the world, which again I think was wrong. But certainly this episode indicated that people in Ireland were interested in and sympathetic to the plight of people who found themselves refugees, and to the present day. I mean, I have to say, in fairness to the Irish people, that they are extraordinarily sympathetic to the people who find themselves in difficulties such as you found yourself and your family and other family members. Again, what gives the victory such poignancy is the fact that it was the exact centenary of the end of the famine. And to have what was in effect a coffin ship coming into the very port that coffin ships had left, but not necessarily completed the journey over to America, really added had an emotional resonance, added emotional weight to the experience in Ireland. So. But thank you again.
Gabriel, this is Jan Laniste. Could you put up the number 20 picture?
I can, if I can. If you could just describe what picture it is.
We're on the ship. It's number 20 in yours, right here.
This one?
Yeah. And that's my father holding me.
Excellent. Have you seen this image before?
About twins being born in the nursery area.
Yes.
Those were my sisters.
Okay. I think I had it. Oh no, yes, you're right. Yes. Okay. Yes. I thought they were the Poles, but a Polish.
Said my father was Polish, but that's wrong.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Estonian. But my mother's Polish.
Okay, that makes sense. Had you seen this picture before?
I actually own one.
Oh, right, okay. I mean, I don't anyone tell John Paul Getty that I've used his picture house attribution. I think they're very striking. But I think anybody who's interested in any of these photographs, if you go to Getty Images, you'll be able to buy purchase copies of them.
And just as a final note, thank you very much.
Well, again, thank you. I mean, I would like, as with everybody else, that if I could get back in touch with you, if there's any details that you may have that you might be able to share about your father or mother, or if they spoke anything to you later on in life. I know that you're on the ship, but you couldn't necessarily remember any of the details. But if you have any memories or documents or anything like that, and again, this applies to everybody, it would be absolutely brilliant to have them. Again, if there's anybody else.
Gabriel, it's Frank Enola here.
To finish off, there were rumors that the Queen,
I guess.
the Queen came and visited my mother in the hospital when she gave birth to the twins.
Not the Queen of England, no. No, of course, she wasn't Queen at that point. Queen Elizabeth took over. No, there were no royal visits to Ireland, believe me, at that point. Ireland, Republican sentiment was still running very, very high. The Ireland had to fight a war of independence against Britain 30 years before. So it's only 7 or 8 years ago that Queen Elizabeth finally made it to Cork. Sort of a very heavily symbolic visit, because Cork was the centre of the military campaign against the British during the Irish War of Independence. So that visit, when it finally did take place, but unfortunately, no, that couldn't have happened.
Okay.
But Vino, I think you were.
Gabriel, I'm Vino Enola, and I was on one of the Viking ships called Barno that came over just before the victory, but we made it all the way across in 16 days. But about 10 years ago, in case you have not come across it, we put together a book of all the Viking ships that came across from Stockholm and from Sweden to both Canada and the Americas and South America and Australia. It's called The Forgotten Sea Journeys. It was put out about 10 years ago. In Estonian, it's Unustatud merereisud. So if anybody is interested, it's put out, and I don't know if you can see it or not.
Okay. Is that in Estonian, or is this?
Estonian, and the background is, or the last couple or last chapter is a synopsis in English.
Okay. I haven't come across that.
And it does contain a history of the victory as well. And as well as all the shenanigans that went on when they started to buy the victory and try to get it to come on board. And it's interesting that one of the owners, Ganadende, and the original captain, they bailed before the ship sailed. So it's kind of very ironic. And the only person that was left to sail the victory was I guess the helmsman. So it didn't really have a legitimate captain to take it across.
Okay, which may help to explain some of the problems it had in making the journey.
If I might, there's also a backstory. Certainly the Canadian government was dead set against the refugees coming across the ocean, and sent many messages, both to our ship and everybody else, that said, turn back, we don't want you. But the captain, of course, being fluent in English, he ignored all the messages and kept on sailing. When we finally did arrive in Halifax, we were, of course, quarantined in refugee camps. But one of the things that's interesting is a backstory, and that is the fact that our ship eventually, we, in fact, were allowed to stay. And when I researched the matter, the government documents from the Privy Council identified that we were allowed to stay because we were considered to be preferred immigrants. And of course, the irony of that story is that it's personal contacts that matter so much. C.D. Howe was the Minister of Everything at the time, reporting to Saint Laurent, the Prime Minister. And C.D. Howe happened to have in his employee a gardener and a housekeeper who were us and Mrs. Lepik, of Lepik's parents. And he knew that the Estonians were really high-class people. And based on that, he made the pitch to the Privy Council that the Estonians, on our boat, be allowed to stay.
Well, there certainly seems, as the document I quoted, there certainly seemed to be a distinct preference for Estonians. And again, I'm not impugning the reputation of any Poles who may be listening in, but sort of there seemed to be a distinct preference for Estonians as opposed to Poles or Lithuanians coming over. Again, if there's anybody else, there's any. I'm just taking a quick look at some of the comments that have been made. So thank you very much. There is. She just wanted me to say thank you. So again, if anyone has any queries or observations.
Gabriel, I'm just wondering if we have the date for the twins. When were they born? It would be interesting to find out who was the lady who became a queen in the folklore.
Yeah. I'll bring that back to screen. How do we share screen? I'll bring it back to screen. Where are we? Refugees, the journey. No, that's not it. Just down here, I think. No.
Look into that maybe later, but it just would be interesting to see who became the queen in the folklore, you know?
Yes.
Who came to visit?
Here it is. Yes, here. This is it. Where it says the report in the newspaper was a Polish woman had given birth to twins in the local nursing home, and they were baptized. St. Peter's and Paul's Church is a very famous, a gorgeous church actually, on the main street in Cork city centre, Patrick Street. So that was I'll have the newspaper reference somewhere. Much of the information that I've used here is based on reports from the local newspapers, the Cork Examiner, which is the main newspaper, and then the Evening Echo, which is a sort of more tabloid newspaper, but still very, very useful, as well as some of the government documents. But most of the details, as you can probably guess, in terms of the individual experience, were based on the local paper. So I should be able to locate that newspaper report and send it on. Again,
leave your email so we can contact you.
Yes, certainly.
But let me jump in here and just say that we are recording this meeting, and we're going to have it on Bemu's YouTube channel. There will be a story written by Vincent that will be in Eesti Elu next week about this event, and it will include obviously Gabriel's contact and also the address to the YouTube channel and all the sort of necessary links to get in contact, because this is sort of a big public event. But for those who want to help Gabriel in his research and who want to dig deeper into this, I think it's quite possible to arrange for future meetings and sort of a smaller group of interested individuals. But all the sort of information and contacts we will be posting, and everything will be, we can see this again anytime, as many times as you like, viewing Gabriel's slides in the YouTube video, which will be on Bemu's YouTube channel.
I'm just typing the details in here. So if you could just speak for maybe 5 more seconds, and then I'll be able to put it up.
All right, Gabriel.
Is there somewhere a list of all the passengers, at least, that we can find? Because sometimes we might know people, but we didn't know they were on the ship. But if there's a list of passengers, we'll know the names.
As you can see,
Yes, I have the list of all the Estonian passengers and how old they were in 1949.
That would be good to have to distribute.
Pardon?
It'd be good to distribute. I'll talk to you later, Malden. I'll talk to you later. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
No, but those are my details. So Gabriel Doherty, my name, g.doherty@ucc.ie, all lowercase. Postal address, School of History, University College Cork, Ireland. If you want to ring me, this is my landline, although we're not in our offices at the moment, and probably won't be in our offices for several months by the looks of things. But 00353, the international dialing code for Ireland, 21, the local code for Cork, 490-2783. But the best way to contact me is by email. I mean, I constantly on email. I'm never off it. At least it seems to be at the moment. So if anyone wishes to contact me, that's the best way to do it. And certainly, I mean, if anybody, again, I repeat it, if anybody has any documents, again, obviously the copies are what we'd be interested in. We're obviously not going to be looking for originals, but sort of anything, sort of folklore, sort of conversations you had with your parents or conversations your parents had with other people, which may have been relayed, photographs, letters, official documents, anything, really anything, just to flesh out the story. There's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of things I still have to do in terms of accessing archival material. But in something like this, which, even though, again, the archival material, official government archives, helps you to look at the high-level international diplomatic aspects. But a huge part of the interest and significance of the story is the human interest. These are all 380-odd individuals. They all end up going there to different ways. Some, of course, making to Canada. Some, as we've already heard, going on from Canada elsewhere. Some staying in Ireland. Some going back to Sweden, etc. So, while I don't think we're ever going to be able to track down everybody, where are they now? But certainly, if we could do as much as we possibly can, and again, just helping to fill in the canvas, it really would help. I'll stop sharing that now. Hopefully, everybody's had a chance to see it. So I'm very conscious of the fact that I've been keeping you now for over 2.5 hours. So I think anybody would be forgiven for getting tired of my voice after 2.5 hours, or rather less. But if anyone has any last requests or
you've been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thumbs up.
Yeah.
Thank
Zoom
you.
actually has a function to do a thumbs up as well at the bottom of the reactions and the clapping too as well. So it truly has been a wonderful transatlantic experience and transgenerational experience for all of us. As I said, this is perhaps the beginning of a series of events, perhaps. And I hope it's sort of the interests and the recalled memories of people. And as I said, we'll be posting this. There'll be a story in ASDLU, and there'll be an opportunity to interact and to help Gabriel. And there's the prospect of potentially a documentary film, where some of you might even have a starring role.
We'll have to reserve places on the stage for the Oscar Awards.
So Gabriel will let you, thank you once again, and we'll let you go to sleep. And for those in Canada, it's time to have dinner, I suppose.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping so long, but it was fascinating to hear the comments and observations there. So thank you, and to thank you for hosting everything.
Okay, and we had over 100 participants, which is
fantastic.
Which is wonderful. So I'm going to end the meeting now. So thank you and goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye to everyone. Bye now. Bye bye.